This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, there are over 68 million internally displaced people globally, and the number of refugees is over 25 million. Sub-Saharan Africa hosts more than 26% of the world's refugees. African heads of state will be meeting in Addis Ababa for the annual African Union Summit beginning on February the 10th to discuss, amongst other things, possible solutions to the African migration crisis. So how effective will the African Union be in finding solutions to forced migration? And what direction will the African Union take in 2019? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, ahead of the two-day Heads of State Summit, Africa's foreign ministers called for stronger action on Africa's refugee crisis. My colleague Girum Chala with more from Addis Ababa. Take a listen.
The 2 days Executive Council meeting wrapped with a major emphasis on several issues of the continent. The theme of this 32nd Assembly of the Union deals with refugees, returnees and internally displaced people. It is said the summit must pass stronger decisions before the situation spirals out of control.
The theme of this year is devoted to the issue of refugees, returnees and internally displaced persons. This choice reflects the renewed will of our leaders to find a lasting response to the burning issue of the forced displacement of persons. We have a dual responsibility in Africa. While continuing to seek the support of the international community, we should contribute more significantly to the mobilization of humanitarian assistance.
The figures presented to these foreign ministers showed how alarming the issue of refugees and IDPs has become in Africa. Today in Africa, there are 14.7 million internally displaced people and 7.3 million refugees.
In the first 6 months of 2018, only 2 million new people were displaced, mainly from 5 countries: Central African Republic, Nigeria, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Somalia. Women are often the hardest hit. The female population of refugees is about 57% in 2017. Africa has the second highest burden of displacement, hosting about 37% of the world's 19.6 million refugees.
During the weekend, the African Union Summit at the level of heads of state is expected to also discuss many other agenda items, among which are the issue of AU reform and peace and security in Africa. 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of the 1969 OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa, and the 10th anniversary of the 2009 African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in the continent. That is the Kampala Convention. Now, after half a century, Africa is yet to achieve full control over its refugee and IDPs related problems. Grumjala, CGTN, Addis Ababa.
Well, let's broaden this discussion a little bit further and find out exactly what African heads of state will be discussing in Addis Ababa. Joining me now to unpack the African Union in 2019 from Johannesburg, Dr. Francis Onditi. He's a fellow at the Human Sciences Research Council in Pretoria. From Cairo, Dr. Ziad Akol, political analyst and researcher at the Al Akram Center for Security and Strategic Studies. And with me in Nairobi, Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to Talk Africa tonight. Professor Kagwanja, I'll start off with you, but gentlemen, I want to get your views on this. Africa's leadership at the African Union will this year concentrate on the issue of refugees, returnees, internally displaced people. This is not a new issue for Africa. Why are they discussing this now? Is it because Europe and the United States have begun rejecting migrants from across the globe?
Yeah, first and foremost, internationally, there is the movement for a new compact on refugees. But if you look at the direction that the compact is taking, it is basically to find an alternative area of settlement of African refugees, because we are beginning to see a fortress Europe or a fortress West, where African refugees are not welcome, and therefore Africa need to have a solution for its own problems.
Right. Dr. Onditi in Johannesburg, your thoughts? Let's hear your thoughts on this.
I think something important we need to know is that Africa is not, it doesn't lack a framework on management of refugees. You remember the 2018-2027, the framework, policy framework, which also developed what we call the action plan for refugee management is very much in place. So I believe the framework, the legal framework and policy exist. What would be important also is going back to the Agenda 2063 to realize that, for example, aspiration number 2, which talks about democracy, governance, and a rule of law. So if we can put these things in order in African states, I think we can reduce on the number of refugees. Probably what we should be having, or what we should be talking about, are refugees who expertise, who are going in other countries perhaps to provide African expertise, but not economic or conflict-related refugees.
Right, Dr.
So
Akula, let me jump in there, Dr. Onditi, because Dr. Akula, I want to get your view, because North Africa is generally a migration hub there. Why do you think the African Union heads of state, though, are going to be discussing this whole question of refugees, particularly with impact to the hub there, the North African Maghreb?
Hello, first of all. I think that the political disturbances that the North African region has witnessed in the past few years have created new challenges and have made new international pressures that are being practiced on African countries or the African Union as an organization. Therefore, the issue of migration and refugees right now is starting to create political tensions in the countries that receive these African migrants. And that's why this issue has become very high on top of the African Union agenda. And in 2019, while dealing with conflict zones in the continent, the issue of migrants will become of paramount importance, because on one hand, there is a very negative impact on the African inside, and on the other hand, there's a lot of international pressure coming from either Europe or the US to actually try and stop this phenomenon.
So there is a lot of pressure, Professor Kagwanja, there is a lot of pressure from Europe and the West generally to stop this phenomenon. But you did mention earlier on about the Compact for Migration, but the United States did not sign earlier on. Several other countries have followed suit. Why are there withdrawals, though, from this compact?
I think there is a kind of a pushback in terms of supporting refugees globally, and the United States, as you know, is itself taking a position that is anti-migration. That's what we've seen, at least the rhetoric during the campaign for President Donald Trump. Now, the key issue here, I think, and why the African Union has decided to take this as an issue, is that Africans need now to begin looking at the core issues that are driving Africans out of the continent. In terms of the West, it is itself facing an economic downturn, and therefore very few countries are able to kind of welcome large numbers. Remember, migration issue is what has given rise to populism in the West. It is what is giving rise to isolationism as part of the policies that are being voted. Brexit was about migrations. In the entire of Europe, we have seen those forces. Therefore, it is incumbent upon Africa to begin searching for solutions to its own problems. And this problem, this search is not starting with the AU summit. It started a year or two ago with regional economic communities. IGAD itself adopted a kind of in its summit in Nairobi, adopted a resolution that it is going to cater for its own refugees within the region. And therefore, it is important to highlight that this is Africa's determination.
Right, this is Africa's determination. Dr. Onditi, do you agree, though, there's a pushback in supporting refugees, and therefore Africa must take, the forefront? But also, we also need to look at exactly what it is that is driving Africans out of the continent.
Beatrice, you'll remember that one of the things that is making the West, anti-immigrants is basically what Professor Kagwanja, calls populism. But there is also a lot of sovereignty, people feeling that, there is a threat, influx of refugees from Africa, from other parts of the world, they are not sure what they are carrying. Either they are security threat, economic threat, or even sometimes, especially in Western Europe, they have even raised the issues of cultural degradation. So if you look at, if you combine this, it tells you that the future of Africa, as far as immigration is concerned, it's in the hands of African states themselves. And we did mention, and Professor did mention earlier, that one of the things, the governance, good governance, putting structures in place that will enable, our political, processes to allow people, get opportunities here. And even in situations where, for example, right, we've got a forced migration, I think African countries can accommodate this, through interstate cooperation, which is provided within the action plan of 2018 to 2027, clearly stipulated. So if we can revoke that, I think Africans can lead or can take, the responsibility of their immigrants, but more importantly, looking at good governance to ensure that even if there were, immigrants, right, there are people who are going to add value to Europe and not a liability.
Dr. Akel, the future of Africa and Africa's refugees is in the hands of the African states. Clearly, countries like Egypt have suffered as a result of what is happening in Libya. Let's look back again and see how much effort, though, has Africa previously put in solving this crisis of refugees.
Well, I think that perhaps the African Union did not do a lot of initiatives towards this matter. First of all, because you still have zones of conflict within the continent. You still have a lot of destabilization, whether in Sinai, in Egypt, in Libya, in Nigeria, in Niger. So you have a lot of a phase where not necessarily an answer could be developed right now. And this is the new challenge that Egypt has to face as head of the African Union and as someone who will be contributing to the policies of Africa towards this matter. I believe that the level of effort practiced over the past few years, specifically since 2011, has not been quite enough, that the African Union has been in a phase of lack of cooperation between the different African nations. We are talking about 55 countries, right, that if they cooperated, if the framework of cooperation is found, it could be done to improve things. But this has not been going on in the past few years.
Professor, very briefly, the African Union has not done much in solving the refugee crisis, very briefly, as you go to the break.
I don't think so. I would argue that from 1969, Africa recognized the need to protect its own refugees and internally displaced, and therefore adopted the convention, the 1969 convention, which is more advanced than the global framework. Again, very recently, in March 2017, the 9 or so countries in the Horn of Africa region adopted what we call the Nairobi Declaration on Durable Solutions to Refugees. And it's one of the most generous has been hailed by the United Nations and other actors as one of the most innovative approach to the refugee problems. What the AU is doing is basically to push to a higher notch that initiative that has been undertaken at the regional level. I think one can call upon the international community to begin supporting Africa in regard to doing this. And I'm sure we're going to get to the next subject, which is Africa is stabilizing its own neighborhood in order to cease producing new generations of refugees.
Right, gentlemen, we'll stop there for the moment to stay with us. We are going to take a short break now. When we return, we'll have more on what lies ahead for the African Union in 2019. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me, Dr. Francis Onditi in Johannesburg, Dr. Ziad Akol in Cairo, and Professor Peter Kagwanja with me here in studio. Well, the African Union may be discussing about refugees, returnees, and migrants in Africa, but there are also other issues being the focus there at the African Union. Dr. Ziad Akol, let's start off with what is happening now at the African Union. This summit will also see Rwanda's Paul Kagame handing over the chairmanship of the African Union to President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt. So what exactly do you think the agenda will be for President el-Sisi?
Well, first of all, Egypt is very much concerned about its role in Africa. It is maybe 2019 is the year that Egypt is trying to recreate or revive its foreign policies, specifically towards Africa. There are issues, first of all, related to security, and I'm not just talking about hard security, I'm talking about food security, water security, and as well as countering radicalization and terrorism in the continent, and developing new frameworks of economic cooperations with African nations. Also on working on industrialization and creating a manufacturing sector that Egypt believes that Africa possesses or has all what it takes to stop or to at least reduce its imports from the international community. So right. There are political issues, there are development-related issues, and there are security-related issues that are on the agenda of Egypt towards the African Union, and it's one of the most important files in Egyptian foreign policy at the moment.
Dr. Onditi, your take, though, what do you see, though? How do you view the African Union chairmanship under President el-Sisi? Because President Kagame's tenure was full of African Union reforms. And Ziad Akol has told us that Egypt has remained concerned about its exact role in Africa.
Well, the two leaders, President el-Sisi and Kagame, seem to be left and east and west, in my view. While Kagame has been practicing a lot of creative, what you could call creative governance, which he has tried to project at the AU. You remember the reforms in finance, the reforms in structuring AU. It is actually the baby child of President Kagame. So that is really something that requires, the leisure of time and creativity in terms of how AU need to be governed. But President el-Sisi his plate is already full. The Arab Spring, some elements of Arab Spring and conflicts are not yet settled. So I'm not sure he's really going to be hands-on as Kagame in terms of trying to continue the financial, the structural reforms that President Kagame began. What I would see an opportunity for President Assisi is because if you look at Egypt versus these other problems, challenges are facing Africa, for example, migration. Egypt is a corridor, and therefore he has an opportunity to maybe front policies which are going to help African countries to cooperate in terms of combating, refugees. So that is the leverage I see President Assisi coming in. But in terms of reforms, I'm a little bit conservative. I'm not sure whether he's going to proceed with what Kagame left.
Professor Kagwanja.
I think there are three tasks that President Sisi must achieve for the African Union. First, he has to continue with the reforms towards financial sustainability of the African Union, particularly its peace and security architecture. Second, Egypt has been a victim of terrorism. He has to up the Africa's game in countering violent extremism on the continent. Sinai has been a victim of the same, and therefore much is expected from him. Third, I think he still has to deepen Africa's democracy. Paradoxically, Egypt is one of the countries that was kicked out of the African Union under his tenure, and now he has come back at the top. And the question at the heart of that is Africa's democracy. So he's going to be looked upon to see how he's going to respond to democracy, he himself being a hard power man. But I think the main challenges of Assisi is how he's going to deal with the geopolitics from the Middle East, Egypt being both Africa and Middle East, and the Middle East now being having countries that are divided and meddling with Africa's politics, particularly in Somalia. How then is he going to deal with this particular question?
So, gentlemen, we are going to wind up shortly, but I do want to get a final comment from all of you. Dr. Ziad Akol, we saw the African Union theme in 2018 being that of corruption. We are now seeing another theme this year of refugees, returnees, and migration. Is this just another theme and another year? Is it going to be another year and another theme? What's your thought?
I think any international organization needs to bring up new themes every single year. And if we are talking about migration and people who are displaced because it is a pressing issue right now, then we should definitely consider other themes next year's. For example, we have the issue of youth, because we are talking about a majority of a population composed of people under 35 years old. And also, we have to consider the issue of education and of human rights. So, of course, migration and displacement is very important, but of course, the African Union needs to focus on a different issue every single year.
Dr. Onditi, your take, is this just another theme and another year? Do we expect concrete results out of this?
I believe issues of corruption and, immigration are intertwined, and they boil down to what we call, issues of governance, especially how African states are going to refine their domestic policy will really determine two things. One, they will have really to adopt the creative governance that we've seen some African states move with. And then secondly, interstate cooperation will be very important in combating especially immigration that has been very risky, and it continues to be a threat to African security and peace.
Professor Kagwanja.
I think Africa has stayed with the major theme of peace and security as enablers of development. And the issue of corruption is part of that in terms of governance. And I think moving forward with Al-Sisi as the incoming chair of the African Union, Africa will have to stay with the question of stability, will have to stay with the question of accountability, so that you don't produce the numbers of refugees, and at the same time to avoid the humanitarian crisis that Africa has been battling with, whether you're talking about Congo. And that's why the focus on elections in Africa is key. The focus on deepening democracy in Africa is important.
Well, if you look at it though, Professor Kagwanja, if they are to make this, turn this into concrete action, same as with the Compact for Migration, what do you think the African Union then should focus on? One single thing.
I think the African Union should focus squarely on stability of the continent. It is instability that is the root cause of the refugee crisis. Secondly, it should focus on good governance. By good governance, we mean transparency, a transparent and accountable regime of operation. That means that Africa is going to enhance development. It's going to, improve the welfare of its people and basically build up its own prosperity. And like Europe, which is not sending refugees to Africa, Africa will be sending expatriates. As my colleague Aditi said, we need to see more of Africans moving from the continent to other parts of the world as experts, as doctors, as engineers, not as refugees.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there for the moment. A very insightful thoughts there indeed, and that's all we have time for this week. But a big thank you to my guests for their insights. Dr. Francis Onditi, a fellow at the Human Science Research Council in Pretoria. Dr. Ziad Akol, political analyst and researcher at the Al Akram Center for Security and Strategic Studies. And Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. And you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist to keep the conversation going, and tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, it's goodbye. Kuchanta is up next with Match Point. Bye-bye.